Good morning. It's time once again for the Real News Radio. And now, with today's show, here's Barron.
Hello, and welcome to the Real News, heard Saturdays, 11 a.m. on WSIC 1400 and WDSL 1520. This is your local news and opinion program where you, the listener, can call in and speak your mind. First, I would like to share with you that the Real News crew went to UNC Chapel Hill yesterday to attend a press conference where we interviewed Ron Paul, and that interview is on our website now, therealnewsradio.com. Today our guest is going to be former CIA agent Ray McGovern, who will be joining us later by phone, and after that we will go to your phone calls. But first I want to comment on the Obama and Reverend Wright soap opera. Barack Obama angrily denounced his former pastor for divisive and destructive remarks on race, seeking to divorce himself from the incendiary speaker in a fury that threatens to engulf his front-running Democratic presidential campaign. Obama is trying to tamp down the uproar over Reverend Jeremiah Wright at a tough time in his campaign. The Illinois senator is coming off of a loss in Pennsylvania to rival Hillary Rodham Clinton and trying to woo the white working-class voters in Indiana and North Carolina next Tuesday's primaries. I am outraged by the comments that were made and saddened over the spectacle that we saw, Obama told reporters at the news conference. His strong words came just 6 weeks after Obama delivered a sweeping speech on race, which he did condemn Reverend Wright's remarks, but did not leave the church or repudiated the minister himself, who he calls like a family member. After weeks of staying out of the public eye while critics lambasted his sermons, former pastor of the Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago made 3 public appearances to defend himself. On Monday, Reverend Wright criticized the U.S. government as imperialistic, and by his suggestion that the United States invented the HIV virus as a form of genocide against minorities based on the Tuscany experiment and what happened to Africans in this country, I believe our government is capable of doing anything, he said. And perhaps even worse for Obama, Reverend Wright suggested that the church congregant will secretly concurs. I find this amazing that Obama goes to this church for 20 years. Obviously, he's aware of his pastor's views, but at the onset of this becoming a public spectacle, he doesn't distance himself from it at once and denounce Reverend Wright. Obama, who is obviously very intelligent, waits and rides the fence and lets this thing bite him on the rear. Why did Reverend Wright feel compelled to do this, and why, when it looks like it could really hurt the Obama campaign and help Hillary in North Carolina? There is an old adage that nothing in politics happens by accident. Oh, and I found it extremely interesting who supplied the bodyguards for Reverend Wright's trip to Washington to be on CNN live at the press club. Guess who? None other than Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam. So Obama's 20-year pastor's bodyguards are from the Nation of Islam. And remember, everyone is trying to convince us, the public, that he is a Christian and not a Muslim. It's just an amazing set of circumstances in regard with the possibility of the presidency of our country. Call in after we have our guest and comment on this subject if you have something to add. And we're going to go to break, and we're going to come back with our guest, Ray McGovern, former CIA agent. Hello, Mr. McGovern. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm good. You're here with me, with Farron and Brian on the Real News. Our listeners may know somewhat of your background as a CIA officer for 27 years, now retired. But I would like to start by letting you tell our listeners just a little about yourself and your career in the CIA.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. My interest in the CIA came pretty early on when I was in college, majoring in Russian and Soviet studies. And the CIA had not been long in existence, and I was really attracted by the prospect of working for a place where all the information on a given country, in my case the Soviet Union, would be available to me no matter what source it came from. And it would be my responsibility to analyze that and report on any significant developments that the President and his chief advisors should know about. So I pretty much recruited myself for the CIA before I graduated with a degree in Russian studies. And I was also commissioned upon graduation as an Army intelligence officer. So to make a long story short, I did a master's degree in this same field. I did my 2 years as an Army infantry and intelligence officer, and then it was a natural progression into the CIA as an analyst of Soviet affairs. And after about 7 or 8 years, I became branch chief of the branch that had to do with analyzing Soviet foreign policy.
We know you were CIA agent during 7 different presidential administrations, and you gave the morning briefing to certain presidents. From your perspective, are we at war with Iraq over terrorism, or are we at war with Iraq over oil and furthering our empire?
Well, that's a pretty easy question for me to answer, but it's not all that clear to folks who really don't have access to an objective reporting on all this. In other words, folks are really getting what the mainstream media want them to get. And so they're told that this all has to do with terrorism. And it's kind of a mental gymnastic, or it's sort of a mental shock to tell them, as I do, that the war in Iraq had and has nothing to do with terrorism. The only link with terrorism is that because we invaded Iraq, the terrorist menace, the terrorist threat to us worldwide has grown by a factor of about 7. And people don't have to take my government's word for that. There's a national intelligence estimate signed by 16 intelligence agencies of our government that says precisely that. In other words, there was no terrorist threat from Iraq before we invaded it. Now there is, and the reason there is the invasion and occupation of Iraq.
Do you think President Bush just claimed faulty intelligence and weapons of mass destruction to mislead the American people into the war with Iraq?
Again, this is a very serious charge, but if you watch the evidence, such as it is, and it's been growing and growing and growing, I cannot escape the conclusion that he knew very well that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And where people would say, well, all right, prove it. Well, there are a number of ways to prove it. One that many people do know about has to do with the fact that the head of British intelligence came to visit his counterpart, the CIA director, George Tenet, and had a full-day session with him on July 20, 2002, so many months before the war. He brought back word, that is, the head of British intelligence, brought back word to Tony Blair and his chief advisors, and his main points were the following. President Bush has decided to make war in Iraq for regime change. The war will be, quote, justified, end quote, by weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. And thirdly, and this is the real punch, the evidence, the intelligence and evidence is being fixed. Fixed is the word the British use. Is being fixed around the policy. Now, that was July 23, so 3 days after the head of British intelligence met with Tenet. And Tony Blair vouches for the authenticity of these minutes from that meeting. And so it's very clear that as of July, the head of American intelligence